Hey everybody, and welcome back to another Max Velocity weather forecast. And in today's forecast, we'll be breaking down the threat of a severe weather outbreak across parts of the United States today, which will bring the risk for significant damaging winds, large to very large hail, and perhaps a few tornadoes. I'll give you the latest breakdown on everything that you need to know in this forecast, but let's first begin with what's happening across the United States today. We'll first begin with the Midwest and the Ohio Valley, and this is already where we've seen a cluster of storms go through this morning. This was a line of storms overnight that brought some isolated damaging winds, and even a little bit of large hail, and this originated back up in Minnesota. It's been crashing down to the south and east, which is the reason why we've seen some lightning and as well as again some damaging winds back in parts of the Midwest over the last several hours. And this is the precursor to what we'll see later today in terms of a threat for severe weather. And the threat for severe weather is primarily across parts of the Midwest and as well as the Ohio Valley. And I'll show you more details on this in just a second. But if you thought this is the only round of storms today, you'd be wrong on that, because there will be another threat for storms later today that could be even more significant than what we saw this morning. Further back up to the north, some more convection back up in the northern plains. This will slowly move off to the east associated with that next round of storms later today. Back over on the east coast, a bit drier than what we had yesterday, especially for the northeast. No severe weather there today, but there will be a threat of that tomorrow. And then back down the southern plains, pretty much the same as usual. It's been, some convection down the southeast United States near Florida, but back down the southern plains, that heat dome continues to dominate, and we are seeing no changes to the weather pattern there. It will continue to stay very hot with a massive ridge, and that's our heat dome sitting down there. That's going to continue to bring relentless heat to much of the country. Now let's talk more about the jet stream across the United States, giving you an idea of what's going to be happening through the weekend and into early next week in terms of the weather pattern. And as of right now, the jet stream is lifted way back up here to the north. That's a zonal jet stream, as it's very flat. Our heat dome is located back down in the southern plains in the southwest United States near the four corner states, and this is what's causing the relentless heat across much of the country. Now, as we go throughout the next several days, the jet stream will continue to start to dip a bit more as we go into the weekend, especially back up in the north and east by Sunday. Notice this meridional jet stream that starts to fill in. That has more curvature to it, and we have a lot more of that going into Sunday. Heat dome continues to sit almost in the same exact spot through the weekend. Low pressure system will start to dip down. That'll allow for somewhat of a cool down if you're back up in the northeast United States. And once we get closer to Tuesday, maybe into Wednesday, that heat dome doesn't move much. It's going to still sit across much of the southern and central plains, but the overall impacts with this heat dome will be really centered across areas in the Great Plains, the west coast, and down into the southeast. Meanwhile, we'll have that cool down and that little area, that jet stream, that'll kind of dip down into parts of the Midwest, Ohio Valley, and the Northeast. Once we get toward next weekend, things become much more uncertain, but currently the European model is indicating heat dome will move further to the east. Meanwhile, the jet stream will remain a bit weaker as we go into late next week, which will allow for more of a discombobulated area for that jet stream. So overall, there could be more variation, especially back up in parts of the central and northern plains. But again, we'll keep posted with the latest a lot of time between now and then. For today, there are excessive heat warnings in effect for parts of the Midwest, and by the way, there's a threat of severe weather in many of these areas, which does obviously add to the confusion. There's going to be excessive heat along with the threat for severe weather, so definitely make sure you're monitoring that threat for severe weather and limiting your time outdoors regardless, because of that massive heat wave that's going to be entering this area with heat indices as high as 115. Heat advisories in effect across anywhere in those orange boxes, which is anywhere from the northeast back into parts of the Dixie Alley. Now let's talk more about the severe weather potential for today. The Storm Prediction Center currently has an enhanced risk of severe weather for parts of the Midwest, and by the way, I would not be surprised if this risk gets upgraded in terms of the damaging wind threat. I don't know if we'll go to a moderate risk, but there's definitely a chance that we have a higher damaging wind threat, perhaps a higher tornado threat as well. It just depends on what kind of evolves here over the next several hours. But regardless of all of that, I might go live for this later today, so make sure you're subscribed down below and click the bell icon so that you're notified if and when I do go live. But overall, the enhanced risk is for the Midwest and back through areas in southeast South Dakota. Currently, the damaging wind threat is not hatched. I wouldn't be surprised again if this does go to a hatched risk and possibly expand slightly further off to the north, but I don't think there'll be any major changes to what this looks like right now. So the main concern right now is the damaging wind threat, and that's because we'll have likely a strong MCS that'll roll through parts of the Midwest, including areas like the Chicago suburbs, with the threat of damaging winds between 60 to even 80 miles per hour. Large hail concern right now is more confined to areas back over here in southeast South Dakota, as well as southwest Minnesota and northwest Iowa. I again would not be surprised if this was a little bit larger and perhaps got expanded into this area as well, possibly into southern and central Wisconsin. But overall, right now, the threat from the Storm Prediction Center as of now is back out to the west. And then our tornado risk is right now a 2% probability. I wouldn't rule out a small upgrade to that, but it's not going to be like a 10%. In my opinion, I don't think it'll get there, but we are definitely looking at least for the chance for a couple of tornadoes this afternoon out of a couple of these storms. But the main concern is damaging winds. And you might be wondering, why all of a sudden are we having this huge risk of severe weather? Well, the reason why is because the environment that we have, and one of the ingredients is the instability. That's like gasoline going into a vehicle. It's what helps to fuel severe storms. And you'll notice how much instability we have here across the Midwest today. Values upwards of almost 4,000 joules per kilogram will be available this afternoon, and that is unbelievable. That's a lot of instability, especially for the Midwest. So this causes a lot of issues in terms of our severe weather potential, which is a reason why we're going to be watching for severe weather today. Now let's talk more about the timing here across the Midwest for today, and you'll have to watch this very closely because there will be a lot of different parts to this. So going into the afternoon, we will be watching for the threat of maybe an isolated storm. It's a low chance, but there's a chance for an isolated storm through about 12 to 3 o'clock this afternoon back in parts of maybe central Wisconsin. But overall, the threat of that's low, and if any storms are up there, the main concern would be large hail and maybe some damaging winds. Once we get closer around 2-3 o'clock, again, things remain dry. You're probably like, what's going on? Nothing's happening yet. Well, storms will really start to fire off quickly around about 5-6 o'clock this evening. Notice where all these storms start to fire off. We'll be watching many areas, but one of which will be back down, possibly back over into parts of the Ohio Valley. That would not really be that significant. The area that we're watching for more significant severe weather would be across parts of Iowa and as well as Minnesota and Wisconsin and Illinois. These are the 4 states I have the greatest concern about today for significant severe weather. Once we get closer to about 7 o'clock, storms continue to fire off very quickly. This area of storms back over west of Chicago is the main area that we need to watch, because this will be our line of storms that will develop. Our mesoscale convective system, which is the MCS that I was mentioning earlier in this forecast, that is what we need to watch for over in this area. This will produce that threat for very significant damaging winds as it moves off to the east. By around 7 o'clock or so, storms are quickly moving toward areas like the Chicago suburbs and southeast Wisconsin, with mainly a damaging wind threat as they track further to the east. We'll still be watching for isolated storms back over in Ohio and Indiana, but it's a very isolated chance. There's a chance for severe weather out of that, but the threat again is going to be a bit more on the low side. By around 8-9 o'clock, storms are continuing to move through areas like, again, the northeast Illinois region, northwest Indiana, and eventually into western Michigan, and eventually by midnight or so, this line of storms will continue to move to the east. It's not going to weaken a whole lot. It'll actually be a bit more organized by this point, but the threat of damaging winds will be slightly lower, I would say, than what it will be back over in the Chicago suburbs. And eventually, as we go throughout the overnight hours, that line continues to push to the east, weakens out as we get closer to 3 and 4 in the morning, and eventually by around 6 in the morning, all that storm activity is much weaker. Maybe another threat for severe weather early tomorrow morning in southern Iowa, but the threat of that overall is low at this time. Now, one thing I do want to point out before I show you the severe weather threat for tomorrow is the wind gusts on the HRR model. Look how it shows the wind gusts. You're going to be wanting to look at the red and yellow colors that are all elongated here this evening. This is where those storms will be, by the way. So the future radar that I just showed you, it's exactly like this, but this is where we'll be watching for damaging winds. You can see how elongated it gets as it moves to the east, and once it goes over the Great Lakes, more significant damaging winds will pick up upwards of 70 to maybe 75 miles per hour as it goes towards Michigan and northern Indiana, and eventually going into the overnight hours, that damaging wind threat quickly weakens as it moves down to the south and east. So I just wanted to kind of show you that for perspective. The area of damaging winds will definitely be elongated over a pretty large area, but the threat of damaging winds specifically in your location, again, it's more of a scattered to maybe numerous threats. So not everybody will see damaging winds, but if you want to make sure you take those proper precautions. Now, going into tomorrow, there's another threat of severe weather. It exists from the northeast and mid-Atlantic all the way back over as well into the central plains. Main concern right now is damaging winds, large hail, and maybe an isolated tornado or two. We'll talk about more on this in our next forecast. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure to like the button down below and subscribe if you've not already.